Emily adjusted her captain's hat, glancing out over the small runway as the morning sun lit up the sky. She felt a thrill run through her as she gripped the controls of the plane. Today, she would be flying from the quiet town of Maple Ridge to the bustling city of Central Point. It wasn't her first solo flight, but every takeoff still brought a rush of excitement. Beside her sat Mark, her co-pilot for the day, an experienced but easygoing pilot with a reassuring smile. Mark had flown all kinds of flights, from long international routes to quick hops between towns. Emily admired how calm he was, especially when she was still working to calm her own nerves before every flight. "Ready to get us in the air, Captain Emily?" Mark said, giving her an encouraging nod. "Ready as ever," Emily replied, smiling back. She took a deep breath, focused on the controls, and got clearance from the tower. The plane began to move smoothly along the runway, gathering speed. With each second, her confidence grew. The rumbling of the wheels against the ground faded as the plane lifted gracefully into the sky. As they climbed to cruising altitude, Emily looked over the cabin. She could see the passengers settling in, chatting with each other, or staring out of the windows, watching the fields and rivers below grow smaller. The peaceful, happy expressions on their faces made her feel proud. She loved that she could help people reach their destinations safely and comfortably. Emily remembered the first time she had dreamed of becoming a pilot. She had been a young girl watching planes fly overhead, imagining the thrill of soaring above the clouds. Years of study, hard work, and countless training hours had finally brought her to this moment. Now, she was a pilot with her own flights, her own passengers, and her own responsibilities. Yet, beneath her pride, Emily felt a flicker of worry. She was still young and relatively new. Her training had covered all kinds of emergencies, but she hadn't yet faced a serious one on a real flight. What if something went wrong today, she thought, trying to push the fear away. She quickly glanced at Mark, who was calmly checking instruments and making notes. If he was relaxed, then surely everything was fine. "You know," Mark said, noticing her quietness, "every flight starts with a little nervousness. That's what keeps us alert, and you're doing great." Emily smiled, feeling reassured. "Thanks, Mark. I just want to make sure I'm really ready for anything." "You are," he said with certainty. "You've got the skills and the focus. Trust yourself." As they cruised steadily over the quiet landscape below, Emily felt her earlier tension ease. She looked out at the endless blue sky, grateful for the calm. This was her dream come true, and she was ready to face whatever lay ahead. Emily was enjoying the calmness of the flight. The plane was cruising smoothly, and she was starting to feel more at ease. She glanced over the landscape below, green fields, winding rivers, and clusters of small towns. It was a beautiful view, and for a moment she let herself relax. But just as she began to settle in, a sudden jolt shook the plane. Out of nowhere, a loud thump echoed through the cabin, followed by a grinding noise that made her heart skip a beat. "What was that?" Emily muttered, instinctively gripping the controls tighter. Mark leaned forward, scanning the instruments. "Bird strike," he said, his voice suddenly tense. "We've hit a flock of birds." In an instant, alarms began blaring on the dashboard. Emily's eyes went wide as she saw the warning lights flash red across the control panel. She watched in horror as one of the engine indicators dropped to 0. The left engine had failed, and then, as if in response, the right engine began to sputter. "Oh no, not both engines," Emily whispered, her pulse quickening. The plane began to lose altitude, and she could feel it sinking downward. "Emily," Mark said, his voice calm but urgent, "we need to act fast. Let's go through the engine restart procedure." Emily nodded, trying to steady her shaking hands. She and Mark worked quickly, moving through the steps they had practiced so many times in the simulator. They reset the fuel pumps, adjusted the throttle, and tried to reignite the engines. But every time they tried, the engine lights stayed dark and the altitude gauge continued to drop. Her heart pounded as she looked at the controls and then at Mark. "It's not working," she said, a tremor in her voice. "Stay calm, Emily," he said, though she could see the concern in his eyes too. "We'll go through the checklist and try everything we can." Emily's mind was racing. Her training had prepared her for emergencies, but she had never imagined facing one so intense. She could feel the weight of every passenger on her shoulders, each of them trusting her to make the right decision. But what was the right decision? Her thoughts tangled with doubt and fear. What if she made the wrong call? The plane continued to descend, and the fields and rivers below began to come into sharper focus. She knew they had only a few minutes to figure out a plan. "Mark, if we can't restart the engines, we need to consider an emergency landing," she said, her voice steadying as she forced herself to focus. Mark nodded. "You're right. But where?" Emily scanned the ground below, searching for any open space large enough to attempt a landing. There was no airport nearby, and all she could see were scattered fields, too small for a safe descent. Then she spotted a wide river flowing calmly beneath them. "Mark," she said, pointing, "the river." Mark followed her gaze, his eyebrows raising slightly. "Are you sure?" Emily took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the choice she was about to make. "We don't have much time," she replied, feeling a new sense of resolve. "It's the only option. Let's prepare for a water landing." Mark gave her a nod of confidence, and they began to adjust the plane's descent angle, carefully lowering their speed. Emily's hands felt steady again as she made small, precise adjustments, determined to bring everyone down safely. She took a deep breath, knowing that they were about to attempt the most difficult landing of her life. As the plane descended towards the river, Emily felt a flicker of hope and a renewed focus to see this through. The plane continued to descend steadily, losing altitude with every passing second. Emily scanned the landscape once more, her eyes darting over fields, roads, and towns. The closest airport was still too far. She knew they would never make it. She took another look at the wide river below, its gentle currents glistening under the sun. The river was wide, with long stretches free from obstacles. A rare, slim chance in this desperate situation. Emily swallowed hard, her mind racing. She didn't want to make a risky call, but the options were running out fast. Beside her, Mark glanced at the river, then back at her, his face a mixture of worry and trust. "Are you sure about this, Emily?" he asked quietly. Emily took a steadying breath, meeting his gaze. She knew this was a massive decision, one that would affect everyone on board. But a strange calm had settled over her, and despite the fear simmering beneath, she felt a firm resolve. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "We're going for the river. It's our best chance." Mark gave a small nod. "Then let's make it happen." Emily took the radio and pressed the button to speak to the passengers. She could imagine their tension, the silent questions filling the cabin. She wanted to offer them reassurance, even though she could barely contain her own anxiety. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," she began, her voice calm and clear. "We're experiencing an issue with the engines, but please stay calm. We're going to make an emergency landing, and the crew will do everything possible to keep you safe. Follow all instructions from our team, and thank you for your cooperation." As she released the button, she felt the weight of the responsibility settle fully on her shoulders. She was in charge of each life on board, each person's family waiting for them. Her heart pounded, and for a split second, doubt surged through her. "What if I make a mistake?" she thought, her mind flashing with fears of the worst possible outcomes. The pressure was almost overwhelming, but then another thought came. She had been training for this her entire life. She had learned how to handle emergencies, how to make fast decisions. She wasn't alone. Mark was with her. The passengers were counting on her, and this was her chance to prove herself, to do what she had always believed she could do. With a newfound determination, she turned back to Mark. "Let's do this," she said with a slight nod, feeling the strength return to her voice. Together, they began the careful descent toward the river, adjusting the angle and speed. Emily's focus sharpened, each movement deliberate, as she calculated the best way to bring them down as smoothly as possible. Emily tightened her grip on the controls, her entire focus on the descent. The river stretched out below them, its smooth surface shining under the sun. Every nerve in her body was on high alert as she adjusted the plane's angle and speed. She knew that even the slightest mistake could send them tumbling into the water, but she pushed the thought away, focusing instead on each careful movement of her hands. "Steady, steady," she whispered to herself, guiding the plane closer to the river. Beside her, Mark was silent, his eyes glued to the instruments, trusting Emily to make the right calls. The passengers, too, had fallen silent, sensing the gravity of the moment. Emily could almost feel their collective hope and fear behind her, their breaths held, waiting for the outcome. As the plane drew nearer to the water, Emily's heart raced, but her hands stayed steady. She silently prayed that all their training, every practice landing, and every bit of her determination would come through for them now. The moment came. The plane's belly touched the surface of the river with a light splash, and they began to slide across the water. Emily held her breath, keeping her hands firm on the controls, guiding the plane forward as it skimmed over the surface. She felt the resistance of the water slowing them down, and with every second, her hope grew. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the plane came to a full stop, floating gently on the river. For a few seconds, there was complete silence. Emily could hardly believe it. They had landed. She looked over at Mark, who was grinning, his relief evident. Then, from behind them, a cheer rose up. The passengers, realizing they were safe, began clapping and cheering, their voices full of gratitude and joy. The sound washed over Emily, filling her with an overwhelming sense of relief and pride. She had done it. She had brought them down safely. Emily exhaled deeply, her body relaxing for the first time since the engines had failed. She leaned back in her seat, a small smile of victory on her face, knowing that she had faced the challenge head-on and won. As the plane floated on the river, rescue boats approached quickly, their sirens cutting through the relief-filled air. Emily watched as the rescue team helped each passenger off the plane and onto the boats. She and Mark stayed in the cockpit until the last passenger was safely on board a rescue vessel. Seeing everyone safe and sound filled Emily with a sense of peace and quiet pride. Once on solid ground, the passengers thanked her with warm handshakes, grateful smiles, and words of praise. Emily felt overwhelmed by their gratitude, but also relieved that she had managed to keep them safe. For a moment, she thought her journey was over, but in the days that followed, she was called into a formal investigation. The authorities wanted to understand exactly what had happened and why she had chosen to land on the river rather than attempt to reach a nearby field. Questions began to arise. Was her choice too risky? Could there have been another option? Emily found herself sitting in front of a panel of investigators, explaining her decisions step by step. The panel members were serious and calm, yet some of their questions felt pointed. They asked if she had considered other options, if the river landing had been too dangerous, if there might have been a safer way. At first, the questions made her doubt herself. She wondered if she had, in her panic, overlooked a better option. But then she remembered that moment in the air, the feeling of responsibility for every soul on board, and the calm that had come over her when she chose the river. She had known then, as she knew now, that she had made the best possible decision with the time and options she had. When asked about her reasoning, she took a deep breath and answered with conviction. My primary responsibility was to keep the passengers safe. The river was our best option for a safe landing. In those critical moments, I trusted my training and my instincts. As she spoke, she saw some of the investigators exchange glances, their expressions softening. They seemed to recognize the weight of her decision, the courage it took to make that call in such a tense situation. At the final hearing, the lead investigator addressed her directly. "Captain Emily," he said, "we understand that in emergencies, decisions must be made quickly. You chose a difficult but effective course of action, and you saved lives. Your actions are commendable." The room filled with quiet applause, and Emily felt a rush of gratitude and relief. She had been questioned, tested, and pushed to her limits, but she had stood by her choices and come out stronger. As she left the hearing, Mark caught up with her, grinning. "You did it, Emily. You trusted yourself, and you brought everyone home. That's what being a pilot is all about." Emily smiled, feeling a deep sense of pride and peace. She had faced her fears, made the hardest decisions of her career, and learned to trust her own strength. She was no longer just a pilot. She was a hero in the eyes of those who mattered most, and now she knew that no matter what came her way, she would always be ready.